speaking of movies that have people wearing pants, which is most movies, to be sure.
Yes, I did notice that most people in this movie were wearing pants.
We come up with the somewhat atypical, at least atypical for us. From 1959, we have the Alligator people, which pretty much, if you've seen any like older horror movie, this woman had an experience that she recounts during like a almost like a psychiatric session, about how her husband went missing. Then she went to search for the husband and finds out what things he was involved in, some type of medical experiments, and then the horrors that she faced during that. Yeah, so the Alligator People is a movie that I've only seen once before, and it was like 12 years ago. So I was definitely excited about seeing this one again. And it's not like it's a fantastic movie, but it's very reminiscent of all of like the late 50s sort of sci-fi horror type movies. If you've seen The Fly, the original The Fly, this movie's almost, at least from a story structure, just the same as that. Only The Fly was in color, this one's in black and white. But I still think the movie looks pretty nice. I think it's a decently fun story. I mean, you know where it's going, but I think it's a decently fun story. There's certainly some scenes that I think stand out, and I actually generally find this a pretty enjoyable movie. But then again, I'm a big fan of like 30s, 40s, 50s horror. So that's my perspective. Let's see what some of these perspective is who maybe this movie is a bit out of place. What do you think, Jackie?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we don't do a whole lot of these older movies, and mainly that's because it's just not something that generally enjoys or entertains me. So I thought we'd do this one. Just I felt like every now and then we probably should do one, and who knows, maybe I'll eventually come across one.
Keep throwing Jiggy a bone.
Yeah, and maybe I'll come across one that I actually surprisingly enjoy. Now, look, I mean, this one, I didn't have a bad time with this one necessarily. I think it's still limited by a lot of the things that prevent myself from giving good ratings to older movies. The fact that it's black and white doesn't really have anything to do with it. We can get new movies in black and white that I enjoy, but I think it's more of just, back in that day, a lot of the movies have very similar types of musical soundtracks in the background, and they're limited with the effects and everything. It's more of a limitation thing, and even though I could rate it based on the limitations, at the end of the day, I just compare a movie to a movie regardless of what limitations it had, because ultimately it comes down to, did I enjoy it? And even though I think the story is pretty intriguing, like it's a good idea, especially back in the 50s, it's a bit out there. I mean, there are some things in the movie, like some alligator shots and things like that, which are pretty cool as well. I think still some of the effects and the music and things like that, they're things that I think of and I'm like, I just can't stop thinking about it. And it's not cheesy enough to be funny, but it's also, you can, like for instance, the guy with the hook hand. You can clearly tell it's a guy just holding on to something with a hook on the end of it. And that's that type of thing. And like at the end, there's the crocodile man at the end, where you can clearly see he's wearing a mask. I mean, you can see at the behind that it's a mask.
Yeah, that may not have been the highest, the best special effects up to that point, because like I said, this movie reminds me a bit of The Fly, and the original Fly movie actually had pretty decent special effects. And this movie clearly, it's more on like the Attack of the Giant Leeches type level, which is another late 50s horror movie. I will say one thing that really appeals to me about this movie
is the 20th Century Fox logo and music at the beginning.
Well, hey, I have to admit, just seeing any type of beginning of a classic movie, no matter what company it is, always makes me be happy. Like I was, from the get-go, I was like pumped for this one. But it's actually the I may have mentioned this in my review for Hatchet, but I always thought swamps were underutilized settings for horror movies. I thought there was such potential for a swamp-based horror movie, and there's not that many out there. And this one, of course, takes place in a pretty swampy location, bunch of crocodiles, snakes, alligators, that type of thing. And I thought it brought a new feeling to the movie that some other horror movies got really good. I mean, there's a scene where she's chasing after someone, yelling, the guy's name in this rainy night, and it's nighttime, it's like swampy, there's all these animals around, it's like all this slime and mud and muck and stuff, I enjoy that. So, I would say the setting for this movie makes it almost a bit more unique than it otherwise might have been, because the story itself, it sort of reminds me, there's a movie that came out, I think it was 1953, it might have been 1954, but it's a movie titled The Maze, and the whole basics of The Maze was this woman looking for her husband who just, disappeared, and she goes back to the family estate looking for the husband. So it's pretty much the exact same thing as this. And like I said, the whole fly comparison too, because of the whole scientific stuff going on. So, I mean, the story itself may not be too unique, but both the setting and I think a lot of the performances, including even as hokey as it looks, the guy with the hook on his hand, being Lon Chaney Jr., or the Wolfman, two people who know that movie. And of course you have Richard Train and Beverly Garland, who did a bunch of somewhat low-budget horror movies in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it's not like, the movie itself may not be great, but there's a lot of small things in this movie that make it, at least for me, a somewhat enjoyable experience.
Yeah, when you're talking about the swamps, there was one scene, I think, where the woman was out and about and at nighttime, and she was like just walking around with alligators right next to her, which I thought was pretty impressive. I'm not sure exactly how that was filmed, but I would have expected a woman to be more being very difficult to film that kind of scene.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm assuming some of that was shot on location. I assume much of that was shot on location. I just don't know where that would be.
I couldn't tell if it was like just some good trickery or not, or if she was really just walking around with some alligators.
I mean, you can certainly tell from some of the scenes in this movie, such as this guy gets electrocuted toward the end of the movie, and it just looks pretty ridiculous. So there's some difficulties when this movie is trying to do like tricky scenes. There's even like one in the beginning where they hit an alligator, and the way it's shot just looks really really off. I would imagine those were either like I don't know. However they did that, I think it at least looked decent.
I actually noticed this throughout. There was I guess it's fitting to bring this type of thing up now, based on everything that's going on in the world, but I noticed there was multiple black servants in the movie, and I guess it's a bit of how things were at the time, but that just really resonated with me to see that every black person in the movie was playing basically a servant.
Well, the unfortunate thing is, because I've seen a bunch of these older movies, it used to be, I'm talking like 1920s, 30s, and into like the mid-40s. When they had African American actors in movies like this, it was almost always for comedic effect. Like there'll be like a cowardly, guy who's always scared jumping at like the slightest shadow. So at the very least, they used these actors to slightly battle impact. I like the idea of this old Southern woman telling her black servant to go tell a drunk white guy to stop shooting. That sounds iffy. Yeah, it seems like it might just lead to a potentially dangerous situation, but hey, this was a different time, as you can tell.
It reminded me of this one scene in a movie called Dance Flick, which I'm sure you haven't seen, probably have no desire to see, but there's one scene in it where Marlon Wayans, who's a very popular black actor, it's a comedy movie making fun of other movies, and there's this one scene where he's like picking cotton in a field, getting whipped by this guy, and he's like, "Oh, I like my job. I picked the cotton." And I don't know. It's just one of those scenes that immediately I thought of, and I mean that scene is funny in that movie just because it's played to be funny. But yeah, just seeing there's at least 3 people in this movie, I think, who are playing some form of servant type role.
Yeah, there was the guy on the train who was like just handing out messages to people. Then there was the 2 house servants, and none of the characters were really all that important to the actual story too, which is another common trait with African American actors and actresses back in those days. Like you could pretty much take them out of the movie and it wouldn't make any difference.
And then they had like I don't recall what his title was. I guess is sort of like a doctor. He was wearing his Colonel Sanders uniform. So that was nice.
And actually, on a topic related to that guy, near the beginning of the movie, when the woman gets off the train and she sees this like radioactive material, this cracked me up. So I'm sure the radioactive material, which is in like a crate, is safely in that crate, but she just sits down on that crate. Like I wouldn't be sitting anywhere near radioactive material if I could help it, but she just sits down and waits for someone to come pick it up. So. That's a brave choice there.
Yeah.
I think that this one, it's not as good as movies like The Fly, which obviously The Fly was a high budget movie, plus it had Vincent Price in it, plus it was in color. So there's a lot of things that The Fly did that this movie probably wasn't able to do. But I think this movie had, I thought it had a pretty good vibe. I like the swampy atmosphere, the setting. The story itself is, a bit generic, because you see a lot of it coming, and obviously, as some of the special effects, the main one that people probably look at, the alligator head, they're a bit awful looking, but even those have their charm. So I'm thinking that if you liked The Fly, if you like some of the older 50s, sci-fi, horror type movies, and you haven't seen this one, I mean, it's not like it's a bad movie, so I'm personally going to give this one a 7.5. I enjoyed seeing it again, and probably round it up to an 8. I can imagine watching this in the future with no problem, having another good time with it, because that is how Jay rolls.
Yeah, well, I'm going to give it a 4. And look, before all the pitchforks come out from the people who are listening to this and, they have an interest in movies from the 50s or just any older movies in general, look, I'm not the person to be listening to if you want a genuine opinion on a movie from the 50s. So, even though I give this a 4, I will say, look, out of the movies that I watched from the 50s, this is probably slightly above average for me. So, my rating could potentially translate to a 6 or a 7 out of 10 for someone who actually, enjoys movies from the 50s. And like I said earlier, I'm just someone who sees all the limitations of the music and the effects and all those things, and I don't know, I just can't get past those types of things to truly enjoy these movies, I guess. If it was like the crocodile guy at the end, the fact that you can see he's wearing like this crocodile mask, I mean, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Like, it could be like one of those movies where you just kind of laugh at how silly some of the things are, and you can kind of laugh at that, but for the movie to be good in that kind of way, that would have to be more of a consistent thing happening throughout the movie, and it's not.
Yeah, I will say some of these movies back then had the idea that if you build things up until the end and just show it once, it would be more impactful, which obviously sometimes doesn't really work out that way.
Yeah, but I will say, I believe the character's name was Paul, but that guy is the 1959 Ditch That Bitch world champion when he managed to ditch her on the train. That was beautiful. Mwah.
Yeah, and that guy was Richard Crane, who is an actor who's been in, he's been in a bunch of stuff in the 30s, 40s, 50s, so he's always a fun guy to see. He was actually born in Indiana, too, on a fun side note, which is if anybody's wondering why who gives a fuck about Indiana, I live in Indiana, so.
It could be your next door neighbor then.
Well, he died like in 1969, so.
Wow. Okay. Maybe he's buried in your backyard. I almost forgot this movie was 60 years old. So,
So you're just like about 60, 70 years out of place, but that's okay.